Okay, so to start the webinar, let me introduce today's speaker to everyone. Melissa Duncan is a supervising attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Palm Beach County, where she's been working for more than 15 years. Melissa currently supervises their Education Advocacy Project and has dedicated her practice to public interest law, focusing on issues regarding children. Additionally, Melissa has served on statewide committees such as the Juvenile Court Rules Committee of the Florida Bar, Executive Council on the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, and the Steering Committee on Children and Families in the Court Mental Health Subcommittee of the Florida Supreme Court. And at today's webinar, Melissa will be providing a brief overview of the legal history of English language learners and the U.S. public education system with case examples from Palm Beach County and a discussion of some other concerns in education for English language learner families. And just before we start, I would like our audience to know that if you have any questions for Melissa, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat so we can relay them to Melissa, at some of the stops that will as she pauses for some for the next slides for some of the sections. Okay, so Melissa, to start, maybe before starting the actual webinar today, perhaps you can tell us what got you motivated and passionate about the topic that you're about to talk about today.
Well, I was a teacher in Phoenix, Arizona for a few years, and I taught at a K-8 school that had a large immigrant population, either students that had been with Mexican heritage that had been in the state for a while, or recently immigrated students from Mexico and Central America. And so that was certainly my first exposure to English language learner students and education. And then when I was in a different project that I worked at Legal Aid, our Juvenile Advocacy Project, I represented a large amount of unaccompanied minors doing special immigrant juvenile petitions. And so then I saw it from the legal status and dependency angle. So both of those helped me kind of get an idea of this subject.
That's great. It seems like your experience as a teacher, and then also some of the subsequent experience you had in the legal field is what you got to, what got you to where you are right now. So yeah, I think it's time that we can start diving in to
That's great.
The webinar.
Oh. That was a great introduction. Actually, I'll go ahead and share my screen. It brings us right into there. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. So that was a great introduction. I've been at Legal Aid, almost 16 years in September in different projects. I did relative caregiver, which is getting custody for people that are taking care of their relative children. And also in our Juvenile Advocacy Project that I mentioned, which was representing teenagers in DCF cases or delinquency cases where the children had gotten in trouble with the law. And now for the past about 5 years, I've supervised the Education Advocacy Project. And so the majority of our cases work with families who have children in public school that have a disability, whether it's been identified or unidentified by the school district. And we also have another component of our work that deals with discrimination. And so discrimination could be like the topic that we're going to talk about today, where there are barriers or discrimination against English language learner students or students because of national origin, or discrimination based on race and disproportionate discipline rates. We deal with a lot of those issues too. A couple of years ago, I filed along with other colleagues, filed a federal class action lawsuit about solitary confinement of our direct filed youth in our county jail. So children charged as adults but are under 18 and housed at the county jail and were held pretrial in solitary confinement without access to education. So we also have that aspect that we do correctional education and correctional settings in other counties and also statewide with the Florida Department of Corrections. So that's kind of what we do. And as you said, certainly interrupt if you have any questions, or I'll pause and you can ask. I like an interactive presentation, and this is a kind of a difficult format to do that in, so we'll make it as easy as possible. And also, just as some of the terms that are used for English language learner students or ELLs, there's ESOL, English as a Second Language, or LEP, Limited English Proficiency. Those are interchangeable terms that are used in different areas and different settings. So you'll hear those come through, but they all mean the same thing. So we're going to dive right in to the presentation. And this slide really, it's about to remind everyone all of the things that are going through the ELL families' heads when they're trying to navigate the educational system, which is difficult on its own. There are housing, financial, food, employment insecurities. Immigration status greatly affects their ability to access services. The threats of ICE raids or deportation is largely present. Legal aid actually puts on power of attorney events and helping families with the unimaginable, that if they went out to work and would not be able to come back and take care of their children because they've been detained, what happens and who's going to care for their children, and helping them plan for that. Also, families are dealing with access to college and career accreditation. So for instance, with the Dreamers and DACA, like students that have worked through high school, will they be able to attend college? Are they going to be charged an out-of-state or a non-resident tuition because they don't have legal status? There was a case some years back about an individual who went through law school and applied for the Florida bar to be licensed by the Florida bar, but was undocumented. And so there are all these challenges that are more than just, do you have your backpack, books, and are you ready for the day, that our families deal with. So now we're going to go into the legal part. And I know you said a brief legal explanation, so hopefully it will stay brief. I think it's interesting, but certainly some of the legal components are more complicated. These are some landmark cases in the United States. And so the first one that I'd like to talk about is Mendez v. Westminster. It's a California case, and I think if you were to ask anyone, name a famous Supreme Court case for education, most people, I don't know, maybe to me, most people would think of something like Brown v. Board of Education. And that case actually came 5 years later than Mendez v. Westminster. Mendez v. Westminster dealt with the child, Sylvia Mendez, of the Mendez couple that you can see hopefully in the corner. And I can move the box around if you can't see it. And these lovely parents had a 9-year-old daughter who was denied access to a California public school that was deemed whites only. And the school district sent her to a separate school for Mexican children. It was not by any means any equal facility. The physical building was untenable, it was dirty, there was a lack of materials, the teachers were unprepared. And interestingly, the child's aunt actually went to enroll the child in school with two of the child's cousins. And the school district looked at the actual color of their skin, and though they were family, decided that Sylvia Mendez, with a darker complexion, should go to the Mexican school versus the white school. And fortunately, her parents were unhappy with that substandard education that was being offered by the school district and decided to sue the school district. So what happened was the district court and U.S. District Court Judge McCormick stated in a decision ruling for Sylvia, the child and the parents, that a paramount requisite in the American education system of public education is social equality. It must be open to all children by unified school association, regardless of lineage. And to me, that's an impactful statement from the 40s. I often wonder what would happen if a case like that came forward today. Fortunately, the appellate court affirmed the lower court's decision, and 2 months later, the then governor of California, Governor Warren, signed a bill ending segregation in California public schools and was the first state to do so. And when I mentioned Brown v. Board of Education, This case actually sets the stage for Brown v. Board of Education because it talked about the separate but equal or separate but not unequal quality in schools. And in fact, the opinion in Brown v. Board was written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was that governor in California who also signed the bill ending segregation. And I'll just keep going, but at the end of this, I'll certainly take any questions. The next one is Lau v. Nichols, another California case. This one was set in the San Francisco Unified School District. There were 2,800 non-English speaking students of Chinese ancestry in the district. Interestingly, 1,000 of the students received supplemental courses in English, but the other 1,800 didn't. So the class action suit was brought on behalf of the non-English speaking students that were not receiving that supplemental English instruction. And they were arguing that they weren't given equal educational opportunities, which was a denial of the 14th Amendment. The lower courts, the district and appellate courts, denied relief. And they said that all students were receiving the same textbooks and instruction, and a petition for certiorari was filed. So the school district is basically saying here, hey, look, in Westminster, the issue was not everything was the same. In Lau v. Nichols, everybody's getting the same thing. And the US Supreme Court granted the petition because it was a question of great public importance. And the Supreme Court unanimously found in favor of the plaintiff students, stating that the California Education Code required English as the basic language of instruction, that the goal for all the students was to learn English, and that compulsory education is a requirement in the state. So they looked at it saying the students that weren't receiving English instruction were not provided an equal or equitable treatment because they really couldn't access the education. Justice Douglas stated, there is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. So this really moved the bar forward from Mendez, and not only saying, do students need to be treated the same, we need to look at what students need to actually be accessing education the same. And the court found a little legal technical thing. The court found that the justification for this decision wasn't under the Equal Protection Clause, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited the discrimination here of national origin or race, color, based on by an agency receiving federal financial assistance. And the school district received federal funds, so was therefore in violation. The next case brings us to Texas. It's Plyler v. Doe. And in this case, the Texas legislature passed laws that changed its education laws to deny enrollment to public schools and free public education for children that weren't legally admitted to the country or could not prove that they had legal standing in the country, legal status. So a class action was filed on behalf of children from Mexico that resided in Texas that were unable to demonstrate their legal status. The district court, appellate court, and the US Supreme Court found in favor of the students. And when the courts look at this kind of thing, they look at the state's interest versus, it's a balancing test. So what the state's wanting versus what's happening. The courts determined that the children were entitled to protection under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And it was a 5-4 vote. Justice Brennan stated that education has a fundamental role in maintaining the fabric of our society and provides the basic tools by which individuals might lead economically productive lives to the benefit of us all. So they showed that the state's interest in protecting itself from an influx of illegal immigration and removing burdens to provide high quality education were legitimate, but there was no evidence that the immigrants were coming to the US just for free education. And there was also no evidence that excluded, that when you exclude undocumented students, education quality was improved in Texas. So that was another case where the states where an individual state was trying to say, like, okay, we hear that maybe federally a free public education is to be provided to all students, but that's not what we're going to do in Texas. And the court struck them down. The last case here is Castaneda v. Picard, and this is filed by Mexican-American students and parents arguing that the Raymondville Independent School District in Texas was discriminating against them based on their ethnicity because classrooms were segregated based on racial and ethnic criteria. So as cases do, they build upon one another. And so Lau v. Nichols had already established that English language classes were necessary, but the efficacy couldn't be evaluated, and it wasn't mandated that it was evaluated. So districts were perhaps giving some kind of English language instruction, but without seeing if it was valid. So the district court ruled in favor of the school district, saying, no, there's no law that's violated here. But the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the students and actually established criteria for LEP, or limited English proficient students, and the quality of the education that they'd be provided. So they said that the programs must be evidence-based on educational theory. They must be implemented effectively with adequate resources and personnel. And then after a trial period, they need to evaluate and adjust for adequacy in overcoming language barriers. So again, Lau v. Nichols said, yes, you need to provide English language instruction, but Castaneda said, this is how we're gonna measure these programs to make sure that they're effective. I'm just gonna pause before the next slide. Any questions? Do you feel like you're in law school? No? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So the next part is US law. And I don't know, I'm moving this around. I don't know if you see it moved around, perhaps. I think when we think about, the standing of immigrants in education, or we think about civil rights in general, there are so many things that come to mind. We think about the women's movement, immigrant farm workers, Black Lives Matter, the civil rights and rights of African Americans, all of these things of LGBTQ rights, all of these are important civil rights. And education and the access to education is a civil right. And so the approach that many of these cases take is looking at US law to bring forward cases. So the pertinent US laws are, and these are federal laws primarily, are the 14th Amendment. So to jog everyone's historical memory, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were created after the Civil War to protect regarding the end of slavery and protecting the rights of former slaves. So 13th Amendment abolished slavery, 14th Amendment cited here, created after the Civil War, was to protect the rights of former slaves, and the 15th was the right for all men to vote. So the 14th Amendment specifically is about equal protection of the laws and due process that's required for the deprivation of life, liberty, or property. And that is an argument that's used in a lot of these cases. So that federal law has existed, I'm going to say mid, but a little later, the 1860s. But the states were still doing a lot of shady things to try to prevent anyone of color from accessing their rights, their civil rights. And so states were doing things, especially in the South, like using poll taxes or literacy tests or other barriers to keep African Americans from voting. Segregation was still existing through Jim Crow laws. Those laws also denied voting, employment, and education. The legal systems in many of those states were corrupt. They were run by racist leaders who unfairly sentenced or made unfair judicial decisions, including the unfair sentencing of longer prison terms and death in many cases for African Americans in the South, and allowing violence from white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. So this is what was happening before the Civil Rights Act, and President Kennedy wanted the states to heed the laws of equality and try to bring forward equality. So he had proposed the Civil Rights Act, and he proposed it in 1963, which would prohibit discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And unfortunately, he was assassinated, but the legislation was pushed through and signed by President Lyndon Johnson. In the educational realm, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act calls for no discrimination for programs receiving federal funding, like schools, which mirrors that Lau v. Nichols language. The third federal law of importance in ELLs and education, public education, is Equal Education Opportunities Act. And this regarded segregation and discrimination in schools for gender, race, color, nationality, and required public schools to provide instruction for non-English speaking students. So this is particularly important for English language learner students. And this was after Lau, but preceded Castaneda decisions, just to put it in that time frame. Any questions? No, these are bulky law slides. Okay.
Do we have any questions? I think we can move on to the next one.
Okay, great. Thanks. So kind of narrowing our scope and looking at Florida. Florida obviously is bound by the federal laws, but also has its own laws and its own cases that occur here. So in Florida, there's the Florida Education Equity Act. It really mirrors the federal law. It prohibits discrimination based on race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, disability, religion, or marital status against the public employee or student for public schools K through 20. And that's 20 to include college and university, public college and universities. The most important case for English language learner students in Florida is the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, versus the Florida Board of Education. So in 1990, there were several groups that joined together to allege that Florida was not providing equal and appropriate educational services to ELL students. And the Florida Board of Education and the parties came together, and a consent decree was issued, and that was an agreement that included terms and monitoring. And it included the requirement for identification, assessment of ELL students, access to programming, training for personnel, monitoring, and specific outcome measures. This is a really long-standing case, and in 2003, the plaintiffs returned to court for enforcement that wasn't happening through the consent decree. And the court added additional certification training requirements for ESOL teachers, also required training for administrators and guidance counselors, and the review of tests that were going to be delivered to ELL students by LULAC experts. So that's kind of my summary of the legal background. So then you get to I don't want to say the social or the implications for the families. And so I'm going to move this box a little bit, just a little over, if that's okay. These are a list of challenges for ELL families in education. This is just a list I've seen from my experiences either in the classroom or my years as an attorney. I'm sure that all of you, and I'd love to hear them, have additional suggestions of challenges for ELL families in education. I felt like the top of the list needed to be bias. That is either implicit bias of how the systems operate, or that the individual teachers, administration, school resource officers contain on their own, which affect the opportunities for education for ELL students. Or, there's certainly explicit bias that we see all the time too. There are assumptions that are made about our students and their capabilities. There are assumptions about their families. The list goes on. And it certainly directly affects and impacts our students. One thing that we see a lot in the Education Advocacy Program is delays in special education opportunities, and so that would include identification and evaluation. The school district has the obligation to identify and evaluate all students with a known or suspected disability. And what we've seen is that if that student that's struggling is an ELL student, they will say, you know what, we're gonna wait a couple years, let's see how their English skills come in, and then we're gonna worry about it. So I had one case that the family was from Cuba, and there was a little boy, and he's in elementary school. And by the time the family reached us, the mom had advocated for years within the school setting for a speech therapist for her son. He had a stutter, and when I was looking at all the conference records, the mom noted at each parent-teacher conference that her son had a stutter, and you could see where it increased in severity in terms of the relationships with his peers, that it limited his ability to interact with them, and then he was being bullied, and then he actually needed to get a counselor outside the school setting because it was affecting him so much. And in fact, the special education law requires that if someone has a speech impediment like that, they should go directly to services. But yet the school district again and again wrote in the conference notes, when his English improves, he'll do better with his stutter. He won't have it anymore, assuming that his stutter was a quality of him not being comfortable with the English language, as opposed to something that needed to be treated by the school district. And so that was one case. Another, we see all the time cases where children have difficulty reading. And they say, well, when they learn English, they're going to be better readers. When in fact, if they could read it well in their native language, then they're going to be a reader in a second language. And so instead of making that assessment, they just say, oh, it's an English language issue, instead of perhaps a disability that needs to be identified and given appropriate services to address. As I mentioned, school resource officers are on campus in Florida. Every school after Marjory Stoneman Douglas has a school resource officer. Some of them are a positive influence on a given community, on a given school, but others, it can impact their same biases can also affect the services for children, and also can intimidate some parents that may be undocumented and would be scared to come to the door of the school and see a police officer there, fearing immigration deportation. So even the things that are supposed to make a campus safe can make ELL families feel threatened. In Palm Beach County, report cards for elementary students are impossible, even if you speak English. If you don't speak English, they're very subjective and qualitative, so they're difficult to interpret, and they're all given out in English. And for the non-English speaking families, they may be given one in Spanish, a blank one in Spanish or in Haitian Creole, and the family has to match it up themselves at home, kind of saying like, okay, here's reading, and then look on reading, and go back and forth and try to decipher the academic qualities of their child or behavioral status of their child, which is very difficult. IDs are required at schools, and not all of our families have those. And again, it's a barrier to getting to the door and participating in their children's education. And there are certainly language barriers in flyers that come home, or home agendas, homework. At every turn, it's an additional challenge for a non-English speaking family. So this gets into some statistics, and I don't mean it to be boring, but it's more factual. There are lower expectations for school performance for non-white students, nationally, statewide, certainly in Palm Beach County. And to give you an example, for graduation rates, in Florida, the most recent graduation rates that were available from the Florida Department of Education, 2018 to 19, white students had a graduation rate of 90.2%, and then Black or African American, and these are all the categories that they use, are 81.5%, Hispanic Latino 85.9%, Asian 95.6%, American Indian Alaska Native 77.5%, two or more races 88.2%, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander 86.7%. So you can see all of the non-white categories except for Asian have lower graduation rates, and that has nothing to do with the ability of the students. It is these barriers that these families encounter, and it is evident in the success of the students in school. Similarly, in Florida, the U.S. Department of Education actually, so the numbers I gave you before were just racial categories that are self-selected by the families. The U.S. Department of Education had some statistics pull out for ELL students, and they had a study. They looked at the years from 2009 to 2017 for fourth graders. And in Florida, for fourth grade ELL students over that time period, there was a 3.1% decrease in mathematics proficiency and a 6.8% decrease in reading proficiency for ELL fourth graders. So you can see already there are challenges, and we're still on a downward trend in terms of proficiency for ELL students. Nationally, and I hope this is the last statistic, I know they're kind of hard to take in like this. Nationally, 2015 to 16, 84% of white high school students graduated on time versus 67% of English language learners. So those differences really demonstrate the disparity in educational outcomes and the challenges that ELL families face in education. I'm pausing, and moving on. Okay. Oh, I promised you no more statistics and I lied. Okay. So this one I won't go through each one, but I will try to move this fancy box around maybe. So this is data from Palm Beach County because that's the county that I work in, and so this is things that we consider all the time looking at our diverse population. So you can see it's as of 2019 to 20, the students are predominantly Hispanic, Latino. Again, these are the categories that the school district allows people to choose, and so you can see those in Palm Beach County. The major student languages are listed there. They're really English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. There's also Portuguese, and then we have Mayan languages. So the school district needs to translate things into the native languages of the parents. The parents hold educational rights, and they are entitled to know what's happening with their kids' education. So they should receive communication in their native language. When we come to the Mayan languages, those are a little more difficult because there are fewer interpreters and it's not a written language, so it needs to be translated in a different way. There are other capacity with technology through videos and different things that could be watched so that a larger population can be reached. But it's still important that everyone receives information in their native languages. For the Mayan population, Spanish is a second language. And so they're even communicating in Spanish, things are missed. And again, going back to that bias or making assumptions, often a parent could walk into the school and maybe the school thinks, okay, I don't know if this person speaks English, I'm going to try Spanish, but it's really someone who speaks a Mayan language, and they're going to struggle to understand things in Spanish as well. Another thing is that given the population and a diverse population, it's important that teachers, administrators, and the curriculum that's taught mirrors the population's needs. And so, and not just, well, I'll get onto it into my action steps, and I think that's an important thing to consider. The need for interpretation. There was an interesting community partner agency of ours that is a Guatemala Mayan Center, works with a lot of the Mayan population, and they had a program where their teenagers were translating in the different Mayan languages. And that's incredible. Like opportunities like that for these English language learner students to actually see their other languages as a benefit and not a deficit is important. There are dual language programs, but typically in Spanish. It would be amazing to see other languages or to see these Mayan languages more curriculum so that translation skills are gained, and it turns into a profitable career as well. Okay, so in Palm Beach County, the Legal Aid Society's Education Advocacy Project has done different things to try to create systemic reform in Palm Beach County schools. So one example is we had made an Office of Civil Rights complaint that actually eventually was joined by SPLC due to a move of an attorney. So that was wonderful. We love working with them. And that complaint basically what was happening is Palm Beach County is the 10th largest school district in the nation. It's huge. And though the central office may have one idea about how to do business, the individual schools have a lot of autonomy. And so different schools were using different registration forms. And on those registration forms, they were asking for Social Security cards, which obviously aren't going to be had by undocumented individuals. And this requirement was a barrier to families enrolling their children in the public education that we already know, we've been through the law, they're entitled to. But the school was creating other barriers, which look a lot like the Jim Crow laws that the Civil Rights Act tried to address, and we're still seeing today. So the Office of Civil Rights, actually created by the Civil Rights Act, what a complaint was made there about the barrier to access to education and enrollment for students in Palm Beach County. And the United States Department of Justice investigated. They found merit to the complaint, and in 2013, a settlement agreement was entered between DOJ and Palm Beach County schools. And I left a quote there because the enrollment policies must ensure that students do not face barriers to enrolling in or attending district schools on the basis of national origin, immigration status, or language status. So we were very pleased with the Department of Justice involvement in Palm Beach County schools. They had 2 extensions of the original agreement, and they would come and do site visits. And I think that I was in EAP for 3 to 4 of the site visits. And so what they would do is they would come from Washington, they would come and they would tour different schools, they would do document reviews, they would meet with our clients because we would be able to show them, like, here's where the school district still may not be meeting the requirements of the agreement. Interestingly, when they first started visiting, we would go to clients' homes, we would discuss what was going on in the schools, and as it got closer toward the end of the settlement agreement timeline, with the change in administration and with the huge scares of deportation, at first it went to our clients would only talk to DOJ maybe on the phone, and then from going to like welcoming them into their homes to then they would only like fill out a piece of paper if our office met with them and they refused to meet with DOJ because they were so terrified of deportation that they wouldn't exercise their educational rights. And that is really what happens here. You know, one system is not in a bubble. So when you have such a huge fear of deportation, you have families that don't access their educational opportunities. Another thing, when DOJ came, they looked at things like student handbooks. Originally, when the complaint originated, there were instances of things like student handbooks being only in English. So there was one child, I believe he was in high school, he rode the bus to school, he saw his bus driver drink a can of soda, and he had a can of soda, he took it out in class and drank the can of soda, got a referral and got suspended for drinking that same can of soda. He was an English language learner student. He only observed what had happened around him because that's how he thought that those would be the rules that he followed. And part of the agreement was that all of the handbooks needed to be changed into the major languages so that students could understand what the policies were and not be unfairly disciplined. And in fact, when DOJ came to do one site visit, and I can't recall which high school it was, had translated their handbook, and it was supposed to be in Haitian Creole, and it was actually in French, which is quite different from Haitian Creole, for the first few pages, and then it just reverted back to English. And so the intent of the school district may be to implement all of these laws and follow them accordingly, but it doesn't always happen, and that's why there are legal aid offices or organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center and others that bring cases forward to try to hold the districts accountable. And as a positive example, later, when we were in the midst of the monitoring with the settlement, or not we, but the Department of Justice was in the midst of the monitoring the settlement agreement with the school district, there was one high school with a large ELL student population, and the school district council reached out to me and said, you know, these students don't have their immunizations, and although they're allowed entry into the school, within 30 days, if they don't get them, we're going to have to exit them from the school. And I was able to, with the bulk of this complaint behind us, to say, look, let's come up with a solution. Why don't you get the health department to come to the school and bring an immunization van onto the school site? Let's call these parents one by one and get them to consent, obviously with proper forms, and have the students immunized at school so that they don't miss anything. But the school district, I would guess, would not be as likely to agree to some of these creative solutions if it weren't for the laws and the litigation. The next case was one that I filed in 2015. This was a national origin discrimination lawsuit filed in federal court. And, you know, I had been working with the Department of Justice and explaining to them what was happening about another aspect that they had not addressed in their settlement agreement. And that was the push out of English language learner students to adult education. So the settlement agreement got them in the front door, but then the school district was pushing them out the back door. And we saw this a lot, especially with unaccompanied minors, teenagers, the refusal to enroll them, which was covered under the settlement agreement, but the push out, which wasn't. And so DOJ actually wrote a letter to the school district concerning the push outs, which I was able to use in my lawsuit. And this particular student was an unaccompanied minor from Guatemala. He attended public high school. He lived with his sister. And upon turning 18, he was told to go to adult education to learn English. And this was before we had the case. He actually went ahead and the school withdrew him. They had no choice. They were given no other options. He paid $50, went to adult ed, sat with a room full of adults in computers with no instruction, and he tried it for a little bit, and he felt very uncomfortable being so young around the rest of the adults. He didn't feel like he could access any of his educational programming through the computer, and then he came to us. And before I actually filed the lawsuit, I had, as every attorney tries to do, use other tools in the toolbox first. And I had spoken to the legal counsel for the school district, and I was trying to get them to get this kid back in school. And they started coming up with excuses from the school, saying the school said that this child was in a gang, different things. I filed public records requests with every single law enforcement agency in the county, and nothing was founded. And again, that's part of the bias that these English language learner students may face in a setting that, if someone writes them off as a gang member, that they're not going to be allowed into school because of a safety concern. In any event, I filed my lawsuit. A settlement agreement was reached. We had a positive outcome. A policy was written by the school district about specifically regarding the unilateral withdrawals of English language learner students, and stating that not knowing English was not sufficient grounds to withdraw a student from school. And also my client ended up graduating from high school, which was a bonus. Any questions? All right, I'm moving along. Okay, COVID-19 happened now. And as much as of a challenge as it is for all of our families, for our English language learner families, it's particularly a challenge. There are major issues with the access to technology. Do the families have the appropriate technology? Do they have access to the internet? In large agricultural areas in Palm Beach County, there are internet dead zones. And so these are places where migrant farm workers may live, and the students that are there do not have internet access. The issue of all of the instruction and instructions being in English on the computer, the fear of seeking help basically due to immigration status or being undocumented. These are all challenges that were bad in a brick and mortar setting are worse in a home education or online distance learning setting. So I never like to make problems or bring problems up without any kind of suggestions of solutions. And I'm sure that the participants have solutions too. I'd love to hear them because they're things that my project is constantly working on to try to generate new ideas to maintain and increase appropriate access to educational services for English language learner students. One thing, I know training is done all over the place, but training for administration and staff, diverse staff at all levels. So, you know, the kids look around at the staff and they want to see staff that represents them. And it shouldn't be just custodial staff or school bus drivers. It needs to be at every level of the school district administration and educators, so that it's more representative of the population that's there, so these kids can look and think, well, that too could be me. And it increases goals for achievement. Universal gifted screening, I don't know if you're aware, but Palm Beach County, you can please note the sarcasm in my tone, has the most gifted students in all of Florida, the last I checked. But really what is backing that is typically white middle-class families, upper middle-class families that pay for private gifted assessments and then bring them to school for as the evaluation of their students. And they get placed in gifted classrooms. And what that does is that it already tracks a separate path of high-performing students and general education students without the extra increased academic services and training for the teachers. The idea of universal gifted screening is one that Broward County implemented a couple of years ago, and they screened all second graders, and they found their numbers in the gifted population increased dramatically the diversity of that population. And so things like a universal gifted screening can give more achievement opportunities to ELL families and education ELL students. You can see some of the things: relationships with the community, increased participation with communities that advocate for immigrant populations. Translator training, I'm telling you, I've been to a million school meetings and meetings with translators. Some of them are great, but some of them are really inappropriate, inadequate. I've been at meetings that I've had to stop the meeting and say, that's not what's being, what's being translated is not what's being said. Either that it wasn't actually what's being said and the interpreter was adding their own 2 cents in, or that it was being summarized and it wasn't word for word. And that's with an attorney at the table. So I can only imagine what's happening when there's not an attorney at the table. And the only way that these families can access information is at the mercy of the interpreter. Career goals for students and choice programs, these are things that need to be equally available to all students. And again, it's not just, hey, we posted on the website, but how are we targeting ELL students so that they actively participate in choice programs? Additional curriculum choices that are culturally relevant, special technological help with this distance learning for ELL families, and then pathways to legal status. As I said, these systems are so interactive. It's vital that there are opportunities. When I was approached for this webinar, we had a discussion with the Weebtail. I had a discussion with the Weebtails folks about my experience with my own friends, my own mom friends, and their experiences in school. And as Palm Beach County is a diverse community, many of my mom friends, most of them are from other countries, from France, from Poland, from Italy, from Israel, from Vietnam. And I see when they have legal status, the opportunities that they're able to provide for their children in school are so much different than my clients who may be undocumented, and where that documentation, that legal status is such a hindrance to being able to access education. So that is where I've gotten. I really appreciate the audience members listening and for you allowing me to speak on this topic. And
Well, that was very informative. Thank you, Melissa, so much for such a great presentation. I learned so much from the very beginning of the having a good legal foundation of everything. We do have a couple of questions from the audience.
All right, I hope I'm ready. Okay.
Just gonna go ahead and read out the question for you.
Great.
This one is from Sylvana from ACLU, Florida.
Yes, there's another amazing. I'm sorry to leave you off. Okay. Yes, sorry.
It's okay. She's asking if you can speak to the experience of students when family members are detained or deported and how this impacts educational outcomes.
You know, as you can imagine, and that's even when I mentioned the POA events, I mean, I try to be clinical. I mean, I always form an attachment with my clients, which is probably, you know, like I just feel so much for them. And at these POA events, it was heartbreaking. Like you've never seen a room full of parents crying at the thought of being deported, at the thought of being detained and separated from their families. And so if I'm hearing the question right, it's the students would be home, but the parents are detained, not education in like ICE facilities. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we're referring to more of that separated situation.
Okay. And so the first thing is, who's the parent? You know, like who's gonna be acting as the guardian for the parent, in place of the parents? Do they have a power of attorney? Does there need to be any more temporary or permanent legal status for a caregiver? Certainly under special education laws, for instance, someone acting as a parent can sign for an individual education plan. And in Palm Beach County, there's a form where someone who's acting as a parent to enroll their child. But I can tell you that the schools aren't even familiar with that form, though it exists at the district level. So even getting a child through the door, and then usually, this is not something where there's an abundant amount of resources for this extra child or children. It's usually could be someone from a church or a neighbor, a friend, or a family member that's pulling them into their home that may already have financial difficulties and difficulties accessing resources. And then applying for benefits, again, it needs to be someone who has legal standing to do that. So I don't have any specific data, though you had all the statistics for other things, and I can certainly look for that. But I can only imagine that the difficulties are compounded both academically and in a disciplined setting, because then you look at you can look at a child like that and think about the anxiety or the depression they may suffer, and it could create a disability that could interfere with a major life function, which is learning. And so then there needs to be accommodations provided by the school to address that. And so that could be, I was a teacher like a long time ago, but there were immigration raids in Arizona when I was a teacher. And we would because the school that I worked at was so friendly and inclusive to immigrant populations, there were activities that we did to make sure that the students felt comfortable, or bringing in counselors. That's something that these schools could do as well, whether it's required by the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act for the disability, or just with the extra guidance support that are provided at every school under Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We can tap into some of these resources to help students achieve more. Sorry, that was long-winded. And I don't know if it went around and it answered, but.
I think that was a really good, yeah, she just said thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
And I love the ACLU. Like they're sorry.
ACLU is actually one of our sponsors, one of our partners.
They're amazing. Yes.
They have been very, very supportive.
Yeah.
We do have a few more questions.
Okay.
Another question is, if our immigrant communities have been discriminated against at school, what do you suggest that the families or the kids that are affected do? Who should they go to?
I think that, there are organizations around the state. I would say, first of all, for legal services organizations, there are two kinds. There are LSC, which are Legal Service Corporation, and they're federally funded, they cannot represent undocumented individuals. Other legal aids, like my legal aid, is a private 501c3.
One of the questions which we
right. So if there's discrimination, do you want me to jump back in? If there's discrimination against an ELL student, I think the first part is perhaps seeking legal advice if possible. And I always think of my clients can't afford a private attorney, so I always think of what organizations would help. I think looking at a legal aid organization to see if they could help. Many serve or work with education issues or work with immigrant populations. There are other organizations that may be of help, like ACLU, SPLC, migrant farm workers, different things, migrant farm workers organizations, immigration organizations like in Miami that might be able to point someone in the right direction. I think it depends exactly what's happening at school. Certainly, if a student even has this much knowledge, if they're being denied enrollment, they could try to say, like, my understanding is that, why am I being denied enrollment? Try to get it in writing. And if it's based on being undocumented or not knowing English, then to talk to the school based on these. I mean, that's a lot of self-advocacy depending on what the issue is. But I would primarily say to reach out to an immigrant advocacy organization or a legal services organization to be connected with an appropriate advice and counsel. I know that like in Palm Beach County, for instance, there are different organizations that work just with, I mentioned our Guatemala Mayan Center. There's El Sol that works with a lot of immigrants in our community. We have some organizations that work with the Haitian population, and they've all brought clients to us, for instance. So even going to your local community agency and trying to be connected with the right legal services could be a start.
Well, thank you so much for that information. It's certainly something that I think a lot of the members of the immigrant communities do face, from here and then, but they often don't know what to do next. What are the next steps? So I'm sure that was they'll be helpful. The advice.
Or Weave Tales, I should say, because you are so connected like that. Okay, sorry. I cannot think of everything all at one time. So.
Well, actually, it goes in line with the question that I personally wanted to ask you, from this webinar today. What do you think are some of the roles that community organizers can play in helping you guys better reach potential clients?
I think being thinking of the best ways, my project has something that's called an education toolkit, and it's basically like a Know Your Rights presentation that we give to families and community partners. And we do outreaches with community partners. When we've tried to organize them just through legal aid, the turnout is terrible. And it's not that people don't want services, because we certainly have a lot of people that think of us as their law firm, but to be able to organize people so that they can hear the information is huge, because there are plenty of people that do Know Your Rights presentations, and so you could organize groups so that this information gets across. Depending on the self-advocacy capability of parents, for instance, some of them could take off and run with just the presentation that we've had and solve some things, or other Know Your Rights presentations that we would do. Others would need more help, and in our presentations, we also offer one-to-one consultations with participants to see if they need more legal advocacy versus self-advocacy. So I think that the local organizations can seek out attorneys to come do presentations. And in fact, in this environment, with everything being so digital, I can do a presentation for you in Jacksonville versus me needing to come right in person, because people aren't going to do in-person sessions right now. And, you could have experts from all over the country. You could create a panel. You could do, different things like what you're doing now to make sure that your folks have the information. Also, certainly legislative advocacy, where if you have people that have stories to tell like you're doing, that could be put in front of politicians to advocate for appropriate legislation. If you have, even on the ground, like if you had teachers that wanted to work with students that needed extra help, I mean, it's certainly the school district's responsibility to provide appropriate services, but many families get a leg up with private tutoring, and if that can be offered through their local community agency, that can be done. Offering, I don't know, depending on the structure of the organization. Like I said, the GMC, the Guatemala Mind Center by us, did the group for the teenagers to work on translations, like utilizing the skills of your population to help that grow into a resource, a real marketable resource where they can have a business based on translation skills or other skills that could be endemic to the culture of that immigrant population. I think getting their message out to the community too is important, so that you have contacts with media and other places to get your story out, so that it's not a myopic view of what happens in education with one group that is the only voice or the only one that's seen, that it's that the students or the educational families participating in education are seen as the diverse fabric that they are, instead of just one group. So even advocating at school board meetings or different things, trying to, if there's a particular issue, those are other groups that may listen for educational concerns.
Another question that we had was whether you advise families who are undocumented and would like to have a will prepared for their kids, for their children, in case they're deported.
So our office doesn't have, we do, there are people at my office that do wills. In my education project, let me put this a better way. There are programs at my office that do powers of attorney for families that may extend to a will or a blank form, depending on if they qualify for that particular unit. So for instance, my office has over 22 different projects, and the way that we're grant funded dictates who we serve. They're typically all low income, but for instance, our domestic violence unit doesn't ask income at all. Or our elder law project also has some leniency with their income requirements. So it would just depend what they would qualify through.
Well, the last question is actually from me. I just, tuning into your presentation just got me to think of, just started thinking why do you think what you do and the work that you do is important, not only for immigrants, which is, it's kind of obvious, right? For their prosperity and integration, but why do you think what you do is important for non-immigrants in America?
Well, the research has shown that having even for on the topic of segregation, for instance, having a diverse population in a classroom actually enhances the learning of everyone. And having that influx of cultural awareness raises everyone's level. So it's not one person on the backs of the other. If everyone's in it together, then everyone as a whole can gain from the system, a better system, a better way of doing things. And, it's just, I think it's evident. We're not only in a qualitative facet of our life. I believe there are quantitative measures that would show that there are higher test rates and performance academically for students like that too, that are enmeshed in a diverse culture.
So for like in the context of education, you're saying that diversity is an important addition, and it's something that could enhance the learning outcomes of the students.
Absolutely, all of the students.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you think are some of the most critical challenges that Florida is facing right now in securing access to education among English language learners? And how do you see the future of the work that you do in the next 10 to 20 years?
I mean, right now, the online schooling, the distance learning, and though the governor came out and said that every school needs to be in person, there will be exceptions for school districts to submit their own plan for approval. And so in places like South Florida, where we're a hot spot, once again, whether it's elections or something else, we always find a way to mess things up. But in South Florida, where we're a hot spot with COVID-19, distance learning, the school board here in Palm Beach County, and I believe in the rest of South Florida, has decided that they will be online to begin the school year. And so that is immediately a major challenge to English language learner families for all the reasons that I stated, the access to technology, not only the actual devices, but the internet and the disparity in services there, and then the language content and the availability to monitor online distance learning, which really takes a parent teacher in the home to do it effectively. And that's not available for all of our English language learner families. So I think that is a major challenge. The immigration policies and deportation, the detention facilities, all of those, they're not providing education to those children that are there. And this is a major concern, I think, in Florida as we house detention facilities. I would also say things like the school to prison pipeline, although that any student of color is affected more greatly than their white counterpart students. And so that is still incarceration, and mass incarceration affects immigrant families. I think, people, when you look at those strict categories that the school district defines people or has them define themselves, like Black, African American, Latino, Hispanic, you forget that we have a large Caribbean American population here, and they are in that. And, I almost think so we have so many, I have a lot of clients that are from Haiti, and they have been subject to the school to prison pipeline. And I would say that their immigration status directly affected that journey to prison. And so that is also a large factor too. Certainly the current political climate with not allowing international students into classes or revoking visas, all of that's going to affect education services to English language learner immigrant students. Next 10 years, 20, I could say what I would hope. I mean, I certainly hope that, our school district offered, and this is a kind of like whatever on the side, but our school district had this summer its 26th annual African American and Caribbean Summer Institute. And I was thinking, wow, 26 years and we are where we are still. And so in 20 more years, I would hope we wouldn't, there would be institutes, but that the plea of people speaking at those conferences isn't for educational equity across all race, color, and national origin. I would hope that that's not the place that we're in. I would hope that we learn from online learning, using technological resources to enhance educational opportunities for students. I frankly, this is my own personal, educational thing, think that schools should have more of a year-round model. So much learning is lost over the summer, and for our our migrant populations, those losses are compounded. For anyone who's already not learning at grade level, those losses are compounded. And so having a schedule where maybe, and when I taught in Arizona, the schedule was like that. that it was a 6-week summer, 2 weeks in the spring, 2 weeks in the fall vacation, and a month in winter. And that continuous learning provided more opportunities. I would love to see multiple dual language programs for different things, more students, every student that wanted to be in a choice program where they could be pursuing their vocational desires so that they stay in school. I would like to see, all of those things, equity in education.
We do have one last question, and this is from Camilla, who is one of our staff members, and she's been working so hard on this project. She, as an ELL student herself, she remembers students remaining in the program and the ESOL classes for more than 4 years. Is there a way we can help English language learner students who get stuck in the program and later on in college? Some of them are required to take English language classes in college, many of which has to be paid out of pocket.
That is really interesting, and I was looking back to my notes because that was going back to some of the case law that we heard. The quality of English language learner education, actually the framework exists already. So I think it becomes then the enforcement of that framework and educating staff and students. Start with educating and training staff to be better at their jobs, educating families to push. ELL plans or ESOL plans are written for students in the program every year. And yet when I've litigated the case that I mentioned about solitary confinement in the jail had an ELL component to it. And when I looked at the records for our named plaintiff that was an ELL student, his English language learner plan had not been updated in years. His parent had not been invited to attend. There were no evidence-based measures being used. The district's ELL personnel had not been on site, and in fact, they were using the English language learner facilitator instead of the teachers to provide instruction. So you had certified teachers that were not providing instruction, but basically there was a translator. She didn't have the license to do much more than that of worksheets that were given by the teachers. And so, but the parent had no idea that this should be happening or these are the requirements. And so certainly for parents that hold a lot of rights to be able to know and exercise them, but again, that falls into, are they documented or are they fearful of exercising their rights? But if they can, to exercise their rights in the educational setting and demand all of the things from the framework that are already set up. So I would say, that the framework exists. It comes down to either an individualized basis of advocating for that, or if there's a particular group, like I was finding at our jail, for instance, that's systemic, or you could find in a county that's systemic not happening and try to enforce it systemically through legal advocacy. I wasn't aware, I don't practice at all in higher education, and so I wasn't aware of that additional cost. I know that would happen for some students that would graduate with diplomas like an 18 credit versus a 24 credit diploma, or a GED where they need to take some classes. So that surprised me. That's the first I've heard of that, but then I don't practice in that area.
Unless we have more questions from the audience, I think we'll call it a wrap. If for those in the audience, if you want to follow up with Melissa later, you can email her at mduncan@legalaidpbc.org. That's her email address, and I'm going to just copy and paste it right here for everyone. Melissa, do you have anything to say?
I just thank you so much for the opportunity and for your interest and for all of your advocacy for all of you. It's amazing. I'm honored to be a part of this, really. Thank you.
Well, it was such an honor to have you on as a very first speaker of our webinar series. I was very informative. I learned a lot. So thank you so much for that. So as we wrap up this webinar, I would like to thank our sponsors, Islamic Relief USA, Welcome in Gainesville, ACLU Florida, Reyes Legal PLC, Mubarak Law, Engage, Florida Immigrant Coalition, We Are All America, Welcoming America, CARE Florida, the Law Office of Karen Winston, Southern Poverty Law Center, UF, Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and the Gators for Refugee Medical Relief. These are all of our generous sponsors, and they are who have made this program available today, so thank you. I would also like to thank, in addition to thanking our speaker, Melissa, for sharing her years of experience with us. I would also like to thank our staff members who have been working on this very hard on this project, so thank you for that. As we wrap up, I would like to mention a little bit, just give you a sneak information on the next of our webinar series happening next Friday at noon. Next week, where we'll be hosting Andrea Reyes, an attorney from Reyes Legal, and Samir Gupta, who is the Chief Change Officer at Some Miracles, who will be presenting about We Are Duval, the training program that they developed for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to teach them more about the city's diversity and how they can work better with the immigrant communities in their area. So I would love it if more of you guys can join us for the next of the webinar series. To sign up for the webinar, you can RSVP online at forwardtogetherfl.eventbrite.com. So yeah, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and I hope you all have a great weekend. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you very much.